Thanks, Jared. Fun fact about this next and final panel, when we were originally planning it, we were calling it How to Spend $3.5 trillion, which if you're following the reconciliation negotiations already arguably feels a little out of date. So please join me in welcoming to the stage How to Spend $1 trillion.
Hello. Thank you all for being here and for staying to the last panel. I'm Dylan Matthews. I'm a reporter at Vox.com. I do some climate reporting, but I'm generally interested in sort of the future and sort of breakthrough developments. And so it's Breakthrough Institute has done great work, and it's great to join them. I have three excellent experts here today to talk about sort of what large-scale climate policy could look like, especially in the next few weeks as Congress hashes it out. I have Liza Reed of Niskanen. I have Joseph Mikett of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Carl Smith, the journeyman economist and Bloomberg columnist, is joining us remotely. So as Alex said, these are trying times for the reconciliation negotiations. The big infrastructure bill that was thought to be a fait accompli has been blocked by sort of Congressional Progressive Caucus members in the House. The size of the bill is currently being debated very heavily. It seems like Joe Manchin wants something more like $1.5 trillion. He also wants some protections for natural gas and maybe coal with carbon sequestration, befitting his position as a senator from West Virginia. And so the downside of that is that we might not get anything. But the upside is that what we do get is very much up in the air and ready to be designed, and new ideas keep being floated as part of this. There was a big push for a carbon tax from a few senators. I will eat my mask if that happens, but it just suggests that this is a time of great possibility. And I think all three of our panelists are going to be talking about ways in which is the time of possibility and how to sort of seize upon that. So why don't we start with Liza, who's going to talk a bit about sort of what a carbon-free infrastructure looks like and some of the barriers to it and how to get there.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Thanks to Breakthrough for having me here and all of you for staying for the last panel. So as Dylan already noted, there's a lot of open questions about how many dollars we're going to have. And when we think about infrastructure investment, there's a couple of things that we need when we think about clean energy in particular. And one is we do need big dollars right now, right? So this trillion is not enough, but it's a great start. This trillion is important for moving clean energy technologies forward, right, along these TRL technical readiness levels. There's money in there for hydrogen, right? There's money that is not just authorized, but appropriated for nuclear demonstration projects. This is money that gets us better at technology. That's incredibly important for infrastructure. But you can't spend infrastructure dollars fast. So we need money up front, but we also need money sustained over time. And Sonia Carley is a professor at Indiana University, and she did a retrospective on the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and what challenges infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure, faced when trying to spend those dollars, because infrastructure is a terrible way to stimulate anything because it takes time. One of the reasons that it takes time is that we don't just have to learn the technology, we have to learn the administrative process. We literally have to build administrative capacity. If all of these dollars do get appropriated, federal budgets are going to be huge. We need to build up the capacity to spend those dollars, to deploy those dollars, but that goes all the way down to the state and local levels as well. Who's going to host these infrastructure projects, how they build their administrative capacity to seek them out, design them, deploy them as well. So we need dollars now, and we need dollars in the future, which is even more up in the air about whether that is possible. But we also need something else, which is not dollars, and it's a real look at what the barriers are to getting anything done. So you can build up all this infrastructure capacity and you can deploy all of these dollars ostensibly to change business models and change technology outlooks. But if there are things that are actually in the way, regulatory barriers in the way, then you can only get so far. And one of those issues, one of those areas that faces a number of regulatory barriers is electricity transmission. And this is very bad for our clean energy future because it is the bottleneck to getting clean energy where we need it to go. We heard on one of the panels yesterday that we need clean electricity, but we also need more electricity. And there's only one way to get it, and it's on the wires. I mean, I've heard yesterday that you can get it from space too, but we're certainly not there. We're not currently getting it from space, so we have to send it. We have to send it distances. We have to send it across states. We have to send it across localities. Alexandra Klass and Elizabeth Wilson. Alexandra Klass is at University of Minnesota Law School, and Elizabeth Wilson is now at Dartmouth Thayer School of Engineering, wrote a paper on electricity transmission regulation, and it's titled A Federalism Mismatch, because it is absolutely a scenario where none of the authorities make sense to get anything done. And so we don't get any of these federally necessary, regionally important, broadly impactful electricity transmission projects built. I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the term macrogrid, but if I had $1 trillion, I would buy me a macrogrid. But we can't do that. Even this $1 trillion completely deployed to a macrogrid couldn't build it because there are regulatory barriers in the way. It is all at the state and local level. And if you need to unlock aggregate benefits for a geographically diverse area, that is a federal need, right? That is something that the federal government needs to address and needs to have the authority to address. And so one of the biggest concerns that I have when we focus on the dollars is these issues of quiet climate policy, about how we make sure that we're changing regulations in a way that we can actually spend those dollars on a sustained timeline. And that is currently not the situation that we have.
Thank you so much. Joseph, you're also a Niskanen alum. Niskanen has been very loud about climate policy historically, but you're going to talk us through some other aspects of how we can maximize this trillion.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Thanks to Breakthrough. It's a real pleasure to be here with three panelists who've all been colleagues at one point or another. It's actually quite joyful. But the theme of quiet versus loud climate policy is a little tough when you're talking about spending trillions of dollars. It really is, right? So quiet climate policy, it's a good ground truth. So the bipartisan infrastructure package, right, is a $1 trillion spending bill. But I wouldn't necessarily think about it as principally a climate package, right? Roads and bridges, public works, broadband internet. There's a bunch of stuff in there that is, at least tangentially related to climate. And then there's some small climate provisions. And I think you could call that quiet climate policy. $100 billion in grants and tax credits for innovation in various places, for deployment of EV chargers, for electricity transmission or grid modernization, which I'm never quite sure what exactly that envelopes. But, but if you think about, is this going to help? I mean, frankly, we're talking about congressional Democrats, cut emissions by 2030? Probably not, right? Like there will be kind of tangential effects, there'll be some effects, but if you're talking about sort of like Biden's ambition for reducing emissions 50% by 2030, that's not going to do it. Which brings us to this separate spending package, which is again, not principally about climate and energy stuff, right? If the top line is $3.5 billion, our internal calculations kind of add up the various climate measures to somewhere between 600 and 700 billion, depending on what you count. Happy to talk about that because it's a little bit unclear. Again, a mixture of tax credits and things, but the overall idea is, I think, and I hope generously, let's take the trends that have been occurring over the last decade and a half, falling costs of clean energy, more deployment of low carbon energy, some potential switch in the future to electric vehicles, and we're just going to turbocharge all those processes by government spending. And here you arrive at a fairly large sticker number. I wrote them down so to make sure that I got them correct. $100 $150 billion for procurement of clean power at the utility level, $134 billion for tax credits for clean energy generation. That's the wind and solar credits that we're relatively familiar with. $80 billion for energy efficiency, $66 billion for EVs and attendant infrastructure, $30 billion for green banks and DOE loans. So you start adding up everything you need to do to put us on a path toward a net zero economy, and you get this like fairly large number. Now, the challenge is, I think what Liza talks about, if you can manage to achieve that spending politically, talk about that in a moment, will you actually get the desired outcomes? It's relatively simple. Well, it's relatively simple to build an energy systems model and include in it price inputs, change those as you're making changes to tax policy, and then your model gives you this decarbonizing world. But I think there's like 3 or at least 2 things that I think are worth interrogating there. One, do we have the material resources, the necessary labor resources to actually realize that model? And do we have the regulatory environment that would allow that stuff, those trends to be turbocharged? Right. And there, I think there's like a total basket of either whether it's the work Liza's doing on transmission infrastructure or things that we've done at CSIS on resilient supply chains for low carbon energy, or what we just saw in terms of mining the seabed to get rare metals and allow those supply chains to scale up. All those are like big open questions that I think can alter the outcomes or change their predictability. One other note where I think you look at the scoring of these bills, or you look at how they're being considered on the Hill and how they could be quite different. I was doing a little back of the envelope math on electric vehicles this morning. So in the Build Back Better plan, they're proposing a tax credit which varies for electric vehicles, which varies between $7,500 and $1,200-$500, depending on whether or not you meet certain domestic manufacturing and labor provisions. But let's say $10,000 approximately. The JCT scored the Joint Committee on, what is it? The
Taxation.
Joint Committee on Taxation, right? Scored the provisions in that bill related to EV tax credits at something like $30 billion and slightly in excess of $30 billion, which, like, if you divide that by 10,000 gets you something like 3 million cars. I think I did my math right this morning. Though the second day of a breakthrough conference, you always have to be a little careful with powers to 10. But if we're talking about a world where like half of car sales in 2030 are electric vehicles, we're going to sell a lot more than 3 million electric vehicles over the next 10 years. So there's also this challenge that like what emerges from your planning might be very, very, very different from what you conceive of initially. I think that deserves a little bit of consideration. There's a ton of, it's too complex to dive into, but there's a ton of questions about these clean energy procurement programs. Will they actually yield the emissions reductions you want to see? And then, like, in an environment where spending is limitless, efficiency doesn't really matter. But are any of these things accomplishing emissions goals with any efficiency? I think is important. But the last thing that I have to bring in, because of my personal attachment and my wish to see Dylan eat his mask, is like it matters how we pay for this stuff. Yeah. And I think Carl can add this. The general acceptance of raising the corporate tax rate on the Democratic side, it appears to have captured 48 Democratic senators. But there are options. A carbon tax is one of them that would allow us, I think, would allow Congress to triangulate some of these trends, right, or some of these challenges, right? If you want, certain senators want less increase in the corporate tax rate. They want less spending overall. And there are a ton of other social priorities that are in these bills that I think Democrats want to accomplish. Then I think there actually is a real case for using pricing that changes as a complement to other things. I'm not proposing that they would switch it out, but it changes the dynamics. You have to measure the price impacts against all the other social spending that's being accomplished. But I think there is, I can stop there, but there's like a ton to talk about in the follow-up bit.
Definitely. Well, and that leads in nicely to Carl, since Carl's our macro guy. And so tell us a bit about sort of where this bill fits into the state of the economy right now. Sort of, do we have to be paying for things, or do we need more deficit spending? How do you sort of push against supply chains to make them work more effectively? So yeah, Carl.
Right. So I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about like why we're in an interesting place here. So for the last about 20 years, I'd say from 2001 to 2019, the United States economy was in what's historically been an unusual place. And for that entire period, the sort of traditional industrial capacity of the United States was underutilized. We had essentially an excess of blue-collar workers, blue-collar jobs. We had downward pressure on blue-collar wages. And as a part of that, we had declining interest rates, declining inflation, and an economy that was sort of looking for some place to put industrial capacity. That's part of how we got the fracking boom. I think that's part of how we got the housing boom before that. And during that period, just about any policy that was designed to sort of soak up industrial capacity, the U.S. economy could absorb it. And so for years, you hear people like me saying, don't really worry. You don't even have to worry about how you pay for these things. You certainly don't have to worry about like investments in infrastructure. You can just push them as hard as you want to go, and the economy will absorb just about everything you can give it. Just before COVID hit, that process was changing a bit, right? Labor markets had started to tighten up at the bottom. Wages were rising. We started to see signs of sort of traditional shortages in industries like trucking. And the economy, generally speaking, seemed like it was about to move out of the strange process that's happened for the last 20 years. COVID has done a lot of different things, but in some ways, it's actually accelerated this change. So the transformation in the economy towards extended warehousing, extended delivery, that's put a lot of industrial strain. Consumer purchases of services collapsed during COVID, but durable goods exploded. And because of this, we've seen sort of major supply chain issues, partially because we can't get the materials, but also partially because demand for industrial capacity has been extremely high. We see that right now, even though fracking is still depressed, fracking used to be the principal driver of U.S. industrial demand. Fracking is still depressed, but overall industrial output in the United States is back to sort of pre-COVID levels. We see rising wages, all across, blue-collar spectrum. We see shortages again, shortages in factories, shortages in warehousing, shortages for workers in metals. We see rising material costs across the board, right? And so what does this mean if we're going to do a major infrastructure investment? Well, so I look, in the sort of fantasy that we originally started out with, where there was a $3.5 trillion in climate infrastructure, that would have required something like an additional 1.2 percentage points of GDP per year. So spreading that 3.5 out over 10 years, which would have meant that the goods sector would have had to go from about 20 million employees right now to about 23 million employees to supply that extra 1.2 percentage points of GDP. That's just wholly unrealistic, probably beyond anything that could happen right now. Even if we're looking to scale down to something like 500 billion to a trillion, we're still talking about somewhere about 0.2, 0.4 percentage points of GDP and about 400 to 800,000 employees that have to boost already in a tight market. If we see that, we're going to see the economy running up against hard constraints, right? So you're going to see higher prices in traditional construction. You're going to see higher prices in housing. It's going to be more difficult for private factories to expand. We're certainly going to see increasing bottlenecks in transportation, so trucking, rail transportation, and probably just an out-and-out sort of blue-collar worker shortage. And so in terms of the immediate sort of hard constraints that you were going to do what Liza wants to do and just, buy $1 trillion grid, they're seriously there right now from a macroeconomic standpoint. What I wanted to say though, when I was thinking about putting this together is, so what does that mean for sort of the quietness of climate policy? And I'm not sure, I think it means less than what we might be worried about, because in this case, there are no real direct links between these effects and sort of climate itself, right? All of these things are about, how much you're sort of overall pushing the U.S. economy and overall pushing sort of jobs in the economy. You're going to get an environment that, number one, is probably very good for, blue-collar workers, and so that's going to produce some support. And the pushback that you get, I think, is going to be against sort of the administration's macro agenda, generally speaking. And so to the extent that you think that you would need to maybe sideline climate initiatives because of the inflation pressures, because of the shortages that you have right now, that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. I think really what you'd just be doing is trading those out for, other initiatives that are also going to push on tight markets and cause inflation to go up. So in terms of quietness, there's so much going on right now, and there's so much spending happening right now. That almost sort of like keeps the climate part of it quiet and keeps that sort of blowback from happening. But at the same time, in terms of realism about like what you're going to be able to put in the ground, there has been acknowledgement that this is a period of shortages. This is a period when industrial capacity is limited, and that's been really unfamiliar for the last 20 years. And so it's going to be against what most people's expectations are in how to change the economy. And then, talking with Joseph, and of course, we're both big fans of a carbon tax. And if I think about it from a macroeconomic standpoint, just sort of purely like what would be good for the economy, the carbon tax is much better right now. Rather than sort of pushing out on industrial capacity, it would sort of be pulling in, on demand a little bit. That should alleviate sort of some of those raw constraints. If this was done in such a way that it, supported the better parts of TCJA, you could also get a little bit of a supply boost. That would take some of the pricing constraints off of the U.S. economy. However, it actually, I think, works the opposite way in terms of quietness, because markets are so tight right now that when you put on a carbon tax, almost all that is going to probably feed straight through the consumer and rapidly, right? There's not going to be a lot of absorption of that by industry. And so I just did quick back of the envelope. A $50 ton carbon tax would probably boost inflation between somewhere around 1.5 to 2 percentage points in the next coming years, depending on what measure you would use. We're already, at 5%, running, early this year. We expect that to come down towards 2%, but another 2% boost would push us back into sort of like this scary inflation territory. And so that actually is a danger here. What would probably work better would be sort of a longer phase-in, like if there's a phase-in from $5 a ton up to 50 over 15 years or something like that. You then wouldn't get the immediate sort of like inflation hit, but you would sort of set expectations. What's the negative, obviously, downside of that is you don't get the revenue that you could use to offset sort of increases in the corporate tax or other stuff like that. But there is a deep irony, I think, that even though the carbon tax is probably a good macroeconomic tool right now, because markets are so tight, consumers would feel it immediately, whether it's through energy prices or even feeding through the prices of products themselves. And so that makes it a challenge from a quiet perspective, I think.
That was a very comprehensive view of the macro landscape. Thank you, Carl. Like one theme that's coming through all of your answers is just that this is a time of constraints. So Carl was talking about being constrained by a lack of blue collar labor, by the threat of inflation. I think Joseph was talking about sort of the budgeting for specific items, like electric cars constraining their ability. I wanted to ask you again, Liza, about some of the state and local constraints on action on things like grids. We're talking about a federal bill here that is happening at that level, and you mentioned there's sort of a mismatch between what areas of government govern these things and who you want to be making that kind of policy. Is there a way for a federal climate policy to circumvent or get around some of these state and local impediments, or what does a best case scenario there look like to you?
Thanks for the question. I have been told by actually people in this room that transmission policy is tedious. So I'm going to work on making it a little more compelling for the next few minutes here in response to your question. So one of the challenges with the way electricity transmission in particular is cited, and I use that as a case study because while it is not universally true for infrastructure, so natural gas is cited completely differently, and at the federal level, it does potentially, it's not only a problem for transmission, it potentially is a problem for any other energy infrastructure we might be building, right? So when we think about how we need to fix electricity transmission, it's also important for how we build regulatory structures around hydrogen, CO2 pipelines, et cetera, right? So transmission is sited at the state or local level. And what that means, siting is how you choose where the line goes, essentially, and often, very technically, they're different legal pathways, siting and eminent domain, but they are typically very well connected in both time and process. And it has made sense to site transmission at the local level because that's where the most need was, right? We had local generation. That's changing quite significantly. And there's two things that these broader transmission lines can do for us. They can bring power from other places from a generation perspective, but also they can shift power across time, essentially, right? So it's not just that we're finding the sun and shipping it out everywhere else. It's that the sun is at different parts of the country at different times too, right? We need to be sharing power in that way. And obviously we've seen in the past year some significant weather impacts that have had incredible impacts on the ability of localities to get enough energy because they've been transmission constrained. But that's sort of beside the point. So it's at this state level, and it's usually legislatively constrained as well. So public service commissions have rules about what they can approve. And these lines have to be approved based on the value that they bring to the state. And a transmission line, it gives these aggregate benefits. And so first of all, even defining what counts as the benefits to the state is not always clear. The grid is very broad and interconnected, right? And these benefits can be hard to even capture, but they certainly are hard to then pie up in a way that meets every state's rules, like minimum barriers for what you have to do. And so that's why we can't get these lines cited. I think, you said get around, and I wrote that down. I was like, we don't want to get around it. It's a profound rebalancing,
Sure.
and appropriate authority. But I do think it's important to think about, and these are conversations that I think need to happen more about how we should do it, because I would argue that there is an appropriate role for federal government in transmission, and it is multi-state high capacity lines. It is not necessarily all transmission. And we don't necessarily want the federal government being responsible for all of that infrastructure, right? It's not about getting around processes, it's about figuring out the right size for what the federal government should be doing, and then the right size for what the state should be doing.
Got it. Joseph, one thing that is coming through in a lot of these discussions is just that the way that this bill is constructed it's making a lot of choices. So it's choosing electric cars ahead of hydrogen or some other alternatives. It's making an active choice to subsidize certain kinds of utility generation. How do you make it the bill sort of as neutral as you can be in regards to sort of not falling into crony capitalism or supporting things that are not that seem promising but don't turn out to be promising? How do you design a climate policy that allows for surprises like that and is more flexible?
That's a great question. I think that you want to think a little bit about the timescale of the flexibility you're talking about, right? So if, like hydrogen vehicle, not an expert, but hydrogen vehicles are a thing that you've kind of like seen talked about, and every once in a while at the DC Auto Show, one of the automakers, I think it's Toyota, brings one.
Yeah.
But I've never seen one in the wild, and I see EVs in the parking lot pretty regularly now.
I hear legends you can get a fuel cell car in California, but
Interesting. Yeah. So I think, one thing that probably to the credit of the people who've designed these packages, they've allowed is that there's a lot of long-term flexibility in my view, but a lot of determinism or attempts at determinism in the short term. So in, what the technology need and the policy need for a net zero world by 2050 is like still a little bit hazy. And I think this construction allows for that, right? There's significant investments across a bunch of technology that we think we might need, whether that's like large scale hydrogen production or clean industry, even like biofuel stuff, and all that stuff is like sort of traditionally fits in the basket of quiet climate policy, innovation funding done through agencies, Probably like a little more industrial policy focused, but sort of planting seeds, some of which may grow over the long term. The near term decisions, it appears when you use like an energy model, right, it tend to be pretty consistent across a bunch of different scenarios. And I think that's what they're trying to accomplish with these like immediate spending provisions, right? Supercharging the generation of renewables, including in that context, I think other low carbon sources, though principally I think that's going to be a renewable story just based on where costs are presently, keeping nuclear open, and then deploying a bunch of EVs. So I think my sense is with some of these programs are probably going to fail, right? Because of material constraints or because consumers don't pick them up. Some will probably exceed expectation. But in the short term, my sense is what they've decided is we kind of know what we need to do. I don't know that Carl would agree. I don't know that like a free market person would necessarily agree because it does limit your imagination. We know what the tools are to have a much more ecumenical policy, but that's not where policy is. That's not where the political economy has driven us.
So Carl, let me get the limited government free market perspective on this. You alluded earlier to sort of the good parts of TCJA, which to non-tax people is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is the Trump tax cuts of 2017. And I have started saying in public for the first time that there are parts of that bill I liked a lot. During the Trump administration, I was less likely to say that. But what are those good parts, and sort of how can we expand them, and how do you make the corporate tax code part of a real climate policy?
Right. So I think some of the best work on this has been done by Kyle Parmalu, who's at AEI, and so he looked at taking, say, a $50 ton carbon tax, and then using that to pay for these provisions in the corporate tax that we call expensing. Essentially what it does is it allows for, it's a complicated concept, but essentially they allow for investment to be taxed, to be not double taxed under the tax code the way that it is now. So, technically speaking, what it allows you to do is when you make an investment and you spend, say, $1 billion building a new facility, you can then write that $1 billion off on your taxes as an expense. Under the current code, you can't always do that. You have to sort of either depreciate or amortize it over time. That causes basically the tax burden on investment on things that are going to increase productivity to be higher than the tax burden on consumption or just materials that you're using right now. So we look at that as probably being one of those sort of like most pro-growth parts of the code. It's the part that sort of lowers directly the cost of investment, and only for people who are doing like real physical investment in things that are going to increase productivity. And so if you took $50 a ton, you could pay for all of those provisions in TCJA permanently. I forget what the net benefit is, but it grows GDP rather than shrinking it, which is what we normally get under any sort of tax, even a carbon tax is in the best world. And so I think that kind of trade-off is what we would look for. So we would be getting a $50 ton carbon tax that would radically accelerate decarbonization, but also sort of a growth in overall business expansion in the United States. And so that's sort of a double dividend thing that, like, I think ideally economists would look for. The challenge there, obviously, politically, is that consumers are very sensitive to a carbon tax, and any sort of corporate tax is not very popular. So you're kind of combining two hard to sell items into one. But from the nerd perspective, and certainly from the free market nerd perspective, that probably gets us like furthest out to the frontier, and it helps with like development of technology for green energy. It makes all of that investment, cheaper for startup firms without actually selecting, which firm is going to win and which technology is going to win. Anybody who is making investments in hard equipment, plant, materials, that type of thing would benefit from the expensing provisions that could be paid for by a carbon tax.
Got it. So the last question I want to ask, and this is open to any of the three of you, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So one big thing we haven't talked about as part of this is R&D and funding for research and development of new and better sort of green technologies, and especially with stuff like carbon removal. If we're going to get to net negative emissions, you're going to need lots and lots of R&D. And the nice thing about it, as Carl says, is that it can grow the economy long term. So long term, the economy's health depends on new technology and science. What's in the bill now? How could it be better? Sort of, how do you think about that component of this package when you guys are evaluating it? I guess maybe we can start with Joseph, and then if Carl and Liza have thoughts.
So I think that it's pretty clear. So the bipartisan bill has funding for a bunch of research and development programs that were authorized the previous year, right? Weird congressional two-step. In my view, that's great stuff. It's a huge investment in research and development for low carbon technology, the stuff we need decades hence, or believe we'll need decades hence. In my view, the real challenge there is just implementation, right? It's like, there is, as Carl said, there's like, we're kind of supply limited in blue collar workers. It's not like there's an army of underemployed engineers and scientists just like wandering the streets of America. And so we need to be careful, I don't think. And so
maybe in Berkeley.
And so we need, like whether or not those agencies can handle that sort of large influx, how they're going to govern that stuff. It largely seems like that's just an implementation exercise at this point, and an institutional exercise as opposed to like a big political fight. Like that seems like it's been handled. Whether or not that number should scale up or down, I'm relatively neutral on. More concerned with, are we actually going to be able to articulate or implement those programs?
Yeah, Carl, do you have anything on R&D?
Specifically, I think R&D is a part in amortization, along with expensing is a good tax provision. It's a little bit threatened. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. I think in the bipartisan bill, we are going to get amortization extended. But what that does is like the same thing I said for hard investment. It allows a lower tax rate on R&D, and that's for any R&D that you do. So I think that's important going forward. Generally speaking, I think what Joseph said is correct too. I always like to have more broader based, lighter touch proposals, but I think we're just about covering that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, so that's good for point of view R&D.
Yeah, and we also just have the Endless Frontier Act, which got a little bit of R&D in there too. Let's open it up to the audience. If I believe there are mics around.
Yeah, and Dylan, what we've been doing is taking 2 or 3 questions at a time and then letting the 3 panelists respond to any or all of them. So I'll start right here.
Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Mark Paul. I'm an economist. So I guess, first of all, I'm trying to understand if this panel is trying to grapple with the distributive implications of what they're suggesting. So carbon taxes, highly regressive. What you're largely suggesting, I guess I'm pointing this to Carl, is taxing the poor to finance infrastructure. Carbon taxes hit low-income households 3 times harder as a percentage of their income compared to high-income households. So I'm just curious if you could respond to that, A, and then B, by saying that this needs to be fully financed, it's implying that labor markets are actually tight. Prime age EPOP is down 4 points. So do you not think we can recover that? I guess I'm just a bit confused on that point.
Cool.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll take a couple more before everyone responds. Any other questions? Or maybe y'all can just respond to Mark while other folks think of questions.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I'll take that. And so first on EPOP. So yeah, I think that the EPOP is down. I think that
Can we define EPOP just for non-economists?
the employment to population ratio, right? So you can think about how good the economy is for workers in 2 sort of related ways. One, what is the unemployment rate? That's what fraction of people are looking for a job but can't have one. Or you can think about it in the overall employment population ratio, just of all people who are usually we look at maybe between the ages of 25 and 54. Of all those people, what fraction have a job? And right now we're a few points, I think 3 or 4 points might be correct, down from the peak that we were before COVID hit. Trying to recover that, I think that's a major goal that I've looked at. I mean, why we aren't getting EPOP back up, why we aren't getting people coming back into the labor market is a deep question. I mean, there are some economists who are convinced that COVID has essentially changed people's values. It's changed, how they look at the world. And there's some workers who are just not coming back. They want to move to part-time, or they want to stay home with their family. And that's why we're seeing this tightness. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, there's some people who suggested that the reason we're not seeing this is because of, or up until recently, we've had very generous unemployment insurance, and that's kept people out of the market. And that when the unemployment insurance went away, people would come flooding back in. I don't think either of those explanations is fully satisfying to me. And I certainly have the hope that we'll see, more people coming into the market over the next year or two, and that would loosen things up. That would give us more room to do all of this, to do any of the growth stuff that we want to do. But at the same time, we do have to accept that, across the board, we're seeing, wage increases across the board. We're seeing companies trying to pick up workers and can't. And that's the environment that we're shooting into right now, even if we can't explain exactly why that is. So I wouldn't give up at all on getting those people back into the economy. But if you're thinking about what's the effect of my policy going to be on prices in the economy, on labor shortage in the economy, you kind of have to expect that at least we're working from this right here. On the regressive angle, I mean, I think that's basically correct. I mean, the hope of the argument that we've always made, I think, I can't remember the details from Kyle's paper and how the burden falls between income groups. But the hope that we've made is that when productivity enhancements happen throughout the economy, that increases the demand for unskilled labor, that increases the maximum wage at which companies can afford to pay unskilled labor. And so that offsets to some degree the recessiveness of something like that. But I don't remember the exact numbers, but you're quite right. At the end of the day, there is more burden put on lower income people, even when you account for those sort of dynamic effects of how the economy changes, if you're funding it through a carbon tax. I don't quite know how to get around that from the point of view of climate policy, because energy is simply a larger fraction of lower income people's, bundle. And so however you're changing that, it's going to be a burden that falls on them, right? So if you did regulatory requirements that push energy in the same way and raise energy prices, you also would be hitting lower income people. So you could think about offsetting that through other parts of the tax code, but anything you're going to do that's going to change the energy mix is going to have a disproportionate effect on lower income Americans.
Joseph, you had something on that?
Yeah, I think that specifically on the invoking a carbon tax, given what's on the Hill right now, that's an insurgent position, right? That's not in the bill, and I think that there's a group of senators trying to do it, put it in there. In reflecting the dynamics that you raise and that Carl just described, the theory of change in the package that's being considered is actually quite different, right? We're going to flood the system with public money in an attempt to actually reduce costs. Whether or not that outcome can be realized, I think is a little bit, we should treat with some skepticism. But I think there is an attempt in what's being drafted to, within the climate provisions, soften the blow of the energy transition or have it sort of socially funded through corporate taxation. I don't think any change that you can imagine happening from here is going to fundamentally alter that being the principal balance that happens. I think it's also important to recognize that there is, if you think 3.5 trillion, there's trillions of dollars of programming targeting low income, working class, and middle class people in this, right? It's the broad democratic agenda. It's sort of testing the Green New Deal theory that if you tie climate to a whole bunch of other public benefits, or the child tax credit is this huge, expensive, mega progressive policy change also included in this spending bill, then like what comes out in the wash as a total package is, I think, what's important. And again, maybe in you making so many changes that the climate part ends up being quiet because society just looks kind of different.
Yeah.
I'm going to wedge myself in here and
Please do.
shamelessly note that transmission diversifies our generation options, including lower access to energy. And I think it's an interesting point when we think about energy, both that transmission does have the ability to bring lower cost energy and clean energy to more households faster, in theory. Also, right? And while I'm obviously pro-transmission, these studies of macrogrids and of the 2050s come to these conclusions about transmission, and I believe them to be true. But we also need to be marching down that path to see that realized.
It's a real challenge to turn computer model output into reality.
That I believe that is correct.
I'll also insert myself here in that Mark Paul, our questioner, has an excellent sort of carbon price and dividend plan that tries to get around some of this with cash payments to sort of on a universal basis, so low-income people come out ahead. And yeah, I think to Joseph's point, it's a really interesting question to what degree the combination of a child tax credit there's also expanded cash benefits for disabled and senior people, approximates that kind of dividend versus doesn't. That it probably falls short in some ways, but it's a really fascinating topic. Alex, do we have anyone else in the audience?
Go ahead, Jen.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So I have two questions. One, to the issue of the inevitability or not of transition that puts a disparate burden on not a technology person. First, two questions. First, to the issue of whether or not a transition to a cleaner framework of energy has to put a disparate burden on lower income Americans, because it is, of course, a higher percentage of their total income, no matter what. I really, as a Californian, have to call a huge hypocrite foul on the progressive movement, which has otherwise had no problem whatsoever saying the rich should pay more. But when it comes to retrofitting your 6-burner gas Wolf stove, if you are in a $3 million home, oh, no, it's, we can't do that. And we are going to continue, even just this past year, subsidizing in a huge way rooftop solar for homeowners with higher rates on renters and those who can't afford those systems. So it seems like on climate, progressive politics is as regressive as imaginable. And that is, to me, an immoral consequence of this parsing of political and real political kind of considerations. So that's the first thing. On cap and trade, lest you think I am bipartisan or non-bipartisan in my approach, the concept that you would give a pot of money to a bunch of politicians who allocate it annually and they would send it to anything other than their own politically favored projects is ludicrous. And it just isn't part of a democratic system. Maybe if we're going to go to China, we can, make sure that money goes in the pockets of poor people. But what it does actually is go to like high-speed rail, because that's the flavor of the day. So I don't think either of these systems, progressive, regressive policies and cap and trade, come close. And I do think there's a win-win that I talked about yesterday.
Oh, okay. So more of a comment than a question, but yes, we have another.
Tisha Schuler. The thing I'm fretting about with this panel is this idea of permitting this infrastructure. And to your point, Liza, about lines, transmission lines, the same thing is going to be the case for any kind of network of decarbonizing pipelines, of course. And when we had this really interesting presentation right before about the very low impact mining, my thought was we will never get that permitted in this country. That's impossible. It doesn't matter how spectacular it is. So my question for the panel is, who will be responsible for something like NEPA reform? But right now you can't say NEPA reform without it being characterized as gutting environmental protections. So where in all of this infrastructure and decarbonizing progress will we actually make it possible to permit and build the required infrastructure? And who should own that? Is it conservatives? Is it Democrats? Well, you can clap.
Yes, please clap, as Jeb said. Liza, do you want to tackle permitting?
Oh, God, yeah, sure. Who doesn't want to talk about NEPA reform? Thank you for throwing that ball right on my lap. So I think this is an important question, and I don't think we have clear answers to it yet. But things do get permitted, and things do get cited. And so I think while I believe there are opportunities to, I don't think anybody owns it, to answer your first question. In fact, I've heard that everybody wants to reform NEPA, just nobody agrees. That's why we're never going to get NEPA reform, right? So everybody owns it or nobody owns it. But I do think there are some things that add clarity and speed to the process. Clarity on what agency is leading a NEPA process. Clarity on how many different things, how many NEPA processes you might have to fall under for different permitting. And I do think when we talk about permitting, one of the things that's important is clarifying these processes, right? And I think there's a real opportunity there for NEPA in adding clarity. And then I think there's also, to my point about like some things are getting cited and permitted, is seeing what is successful as well. When are we starting the process? I'm going to pitch now. I'm going to pitch to Joseph while I think through the rest of my thoughts on NEPA.
Yeah, I don't know that I have like, it's tricky because I believe that NEPA is a big barrier and could potentially be a real spoiler on any climate plan, whether it's spending driven or tax code driven or regulation driven, because the fundamental thing that has to happen is you're going to retire or significantly modify a bunch of existing infrastructure which emits fossil fuels and then build a bunch of stuff that replaces it. I think, our friends and colleagues at the Breakthrough Institute have thought long and hard about how, and probably we're ahead of the curve, thinking about how challenging that would be as a political project. Excuse me. When I think about, say some big package passes this year or some moderated package, what we then want to do is make sure that it works to its best ability, which means making the U.S. a compelling place, an attractive place for low carbon investment. I think there are NEPA reforms that could happen. There's it's like the siting and permitting and structural regulatory issues that Liza addresses on the transmission side. There's the tax code issues related to expensing and investment that Carl brought up that I think are also pretty compelling to me. I think that whole concept should be owned by some combination of centrist, practically oriented people. I think the business community can be significantly involved in that concept, in that place. I don't know that it has a particular conservative or democratic valiance because you're balancing a lot more issues than just like one permitting program that people historically have beef with.
Got it. Anyone in the audience? If we're waiting, I did want to bring back the point the questioner raised earlier about sort of the distributional impact of credits for things like rooftop solar. You could add in electric cars. It might be a little perverse that if you buy a new electric Audi, you get a federal tax credit, but you don't if you're buying like a beater Corolla. And I'm curious how, and this is I'm open to this to anyone on the panel, how you think about sort of the distribution there, but also, one fewer gas car on the road is one fewer gas car on the road, regardless of how rich the person who owns it is. So how do you balance the environmental and distributional objectives here? Maybe Carl, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a free market perspective, it's very easy, I guess, for me to hold in my mind sort of like a separation there that we have a sort of ideal sort of climate and growth policy, and we try to do that to get the biggest bang for our buck. And then we have a separate discussion over, a policy that I would say like the child tax credit, which then is as targeted as we can towards, the kind of people who are going to really need money, regardless of why it is that, they're disadvantaged. If they're disadvantaged simply because of labor market, disadvantaged because of higher energy costs, or disadvantaged because they don't have access to some of these, subsidies for new programs. Regardless of why that is, we, in sort of a separate calculus, provide that funding. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I do completely recognize, though, that sort of like dichotomy doesn't work for a lot of people, and that's a political challenge. I thought about, this sort of relating to some of the regulatory issues, maybe is some of the harder stuff, regulation or on regressive things, are moves that conservatives could help make if they didn't have to claim them, as climate. They could claim them as growth. They could claim them as, capturing the energy future of the world, making the United States a place for energy future. And then that leaves room for Democrats to come in and adjust them in ways that improve, progressivity or take care of people who are at the bottom. So if we could get that sort of like quiet two-step, that's my ideal. But of course, that I guess that's what we were all here, trying to figure out how to do.
Absolutely. So I think we have time for one last round of questions. I think up front and I think we have two up front.
Hi, I'm Stein from the Breakthrough Institute. So we've talked a lot about barriers to actually implementing these infrastructure programs if we do get the funding, such as regulatory and supply chain and even workforce. How can and should the federal government place a value on the lost investment from these bills and from projects that inevitably fail due to the implemented barriers, such as offshore wind projects that never were built because of NEPA concerns, or transmission projects that can't be built because of various other things. So can some sort of metric be built in to value the lost opportunity, the wasted investment, essentially?
My question is, when we are talking about the carbon tax, right? So it means that just look at the simple market mechanism, right? So you do not need then the solar panel to be subsidized because the market will take care of it. So why are we taking a static macro model to answer these dynamics? And the second thing is that then the money which comes through the carbon tax can be used for maybe labor tax reduction or benefit to the labor, and so redistribute it in a completely different way, rather than thinking that this money will be spent for subsidizing the solar, because that will anyway be competing with the market price of the fossil fuels at that time. So I think we need to think out of the box in the macro modeling itself, and also all the macro models, so far I know, considers that the price of the energy will grow up, and that's what is going to change the GDP, productivity, etc. But we are not taking the consideration that the industries and other sectors have also come up with different technologies which are substitutes, and that input substitution possibility changes the macro model results. So I think it's time for us to revisit the standard macro models which we use for understanding what will be the impact of the carbon tax, because this was 20 years back, the models were built, and now the whole structure of the economy has changed. And if you really bring in those structural changes into the macro model, the results will be very different. We need to think differently if we are thinking in a dynamic framework.
All right. We're coming a little over time, so I'll just give each of the panelists an opportunity to respond to that and the previous question, and maybe sort of sum up what the message they want to get across here. So Liza, want to start?
Sure, thanks. I'll primarily respond to Adam's question about how we think about looking at the loss cost or this opportunity loss. And there actually are ways that we can already do this, and in fact that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is looking to implement this potentially in transmission planning, because this is a problem in transmission planning as well, is that you make a plan, but not a comparison against what the other plans could be, right? And so there's a lot of discussion in the transmission world about scenario planning, even at the regional level, utility level, and at the regional level. Let's be clear on what a number of different scenarios are and why we want to take a path forward. And that really helps show what these different costs are. It's interesting. The other piece I'll add to that, Adam, is, you said, should the federal government do it? I don't know that I think that the federal government should do it, but I think there's a role that models play in helping inform policy, right? So these macrogrid models show us that transmission can lower costs, right? And if we don't build the transmission, it's higher cost. So that starts changing policy discussions about what we need to invest in. And then RTOs, these regional transmission authorities, aren't on the federal level, but they are at a level that is considering what these lost opportunity costs could be. So I think those conversations are happening, at least in transmission. I don't know if I would say that I think it should happen at the federal level in terms of how policies actually get written and set, though. And to sum up my points, macrogrid.
Joseph, do you have a catchphrase?
I do, but everyone knows it already. I think that, it's always the last questions that really put you on the spot with the question of like, let's revise macroeconomic modeling or figure out ways to rigorously evaluate counterfactual states of the world. My comment would be, regardless of the form that this infrastructure package takes, and respecting the not insignificant probability that there's nothing, as we're embarking on, I think, the transition from quiet to loud climate policy, policymakers are going to have to get used to evaluating programs more rigorously, being more resilient to failure, and not having that failure create political noise, right? Of the sort of dozens of Solyndra kind of rhetoric, because we don't exactly know what the solution is going to be, and some programs will work and some won't.
Carl, close us out.
Yeah, so I would say, just in response to the last question, I think you're right, definitely on different ways to recycle the funding. I do think we need to be honest that it is difficult to take away the regressivity through any of those types of recycling mechanisms, just because energy costs are so concentrated, or such a large portion of lower income people's budget. At the very bottom, it's often very difficult to get rid of that regressivity. But in thinking about how the marginal cost of abatement might have changed, which I think is what you were getting at in terms of new technologies, that's certainly advancements that we could do. And I think, kind of like Joseph said, not only, thinking about how we spend this money or new policies, but thinking about how we better incorporate, all this into models that show trade-offs is precisely what we need. And I hope to, help people work with that and publicize the work that they do with that and push that forward. So thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you on our panel. Thank you for everyone in the audience for attending. Let's give it up for them one last time.